And let me just introduce you as welcome to the in my case the late morning session, or the evening or the night session. Our first speaker this afternoon or this morning is David Shea, who will talk about, I think it's fair to say, so much of our discussion has been about untrustworthy communication channels. And I think it's fair to say that he will talk about untrustworthy communicators. So, but in any case, please take it away, David.
Great. Thanks very much for inviting me here to this great workshop. So I'm glad I follow Madhu's talk, because my talk is also about a analogy between the communication problem and the computing problem. But the analogy is sort of a different direction, so I think it's very interesting. So this is joint work with my students, Joachim and Nusret class. And if you have any question about the talk, please send your questions on the Slack channel. You see answers from me while I'm talking. That's not because I can do parallel processing. It's because Joachim is answering the questions, so don't be alarmed. So if you have any questions, Joachim will try to answer them in real time. And if there are some leftover interesting questions, we can also discuss them at the end of the talk or in the panel discussion. Okay, all right. So let's start with communication. So Shannon, 1948, formulated the communication problem, well known to this community. So you have some bits you want to send, you encode them, you send it through a channel. And the channel is noisy, so some of those bits get flipped or erased. And the decoder's job is to try to figure out the original message. So this is Shannon's communication problem. And what he's envisioning, the vision here, is to essentially convert this system, which is unreliable, the unreliability comes from the channel, by using encoders and decoders, which we'll think of a protocol, Pi, which essentially converts an unreliable system to a reliable noiseless link abstraction. So this box with input bits 101 and output bits hopefully identical to the input bits is the goal of the abstraction. And the question he asked was the following: what are the fundamental limits to achieve this abstraction, to achieve this reliable communication? And by that, it means what is the sort of the minimal error rate that you can tolerate in order to achieve this reliable communication? And so this was 1948. If we fast forward to 30 years later, there is another body of work on another coast of the United States, on the West Coast this time, which talks about a seemingly totally different problem. But in fact, I argue that this problem in spirit is very related to the communication problem, because it is a problem of how to build a reliable system from unreliable components. And this is a problem of consensus. So here's the problem. You have a bunch of nodes sitting in a distributed network that are connected together through communication channels. And at each node, there are input. In the language of Lamport, Pease and Shostak, who started this work, these inputs are called maybe commands from the Byzantine general or request. And so you have these request commands, and modern day we call them now transactions, but nevertheless they're just a bunch of sequence of bits, for example. So you have each transaction come in different nodes, and the job of the network is to generate at the output of all these nodes the same sequence. And this output is called a log, or it's called a ledger, and it's basically a record of history of a common ordering. Why are they interested in this problem? Why are they interested in this problem? Seems like a kind of weird problem. Before I do that, let us first say why this is not a trivial problem and where the unreliability comes in. First, the communication nodes have delay between them, So which means that the nodes may have different view of what the situation is. In the bad situation, the network may also get disconnected over a significant period of time. This is so-called network partition. That may happen as well. Moreover, some of these nodes are so-called Byzantine nodes. This is in the language of Lamport. Byzantine nodes meaning nodes that will do bad actions. They can not follow the protocol. They can do weird things to try to disrupt this consensus. And the job of the protocol is to build an abstraction out of this unreliable system for which the input sequence transactions arises a log which is common across all output, and that's what consensus means. Consensus means agreed upon history at all the nodes. And this is so-called state machine replication. And really what they're trying to do here is the following. You're trying to build a very reliable computer you can think of. However, your individual computers are quite unreliable, and in fact, they can do weird things to you. And the question is, how do you build from these unreliable computers a very reliable abstraction? And that's what they call, or the community calls, state machine replication. And just like Shannon, to build a noiseless link abstraction, the goal here is to build an abstraction. And what's the goal of this abstraction? The goal is given by two properties. One is called safety, which means that the log sequence is consistent with each other, just as I had in this picture. But the second thing is also important, which is liveness. That means the transactions input will eventually get into the output. Obviously, if you don't have liveness, then safety is meaningless because you can always generate a fixed sequence at all the nodes and you're done. Liveness basically means that the input instructions are followed. And so that is the two property for this abstraction. And again, the same question asked, which is, what are the fundamental limits of reliable distributed computing this time? Okay. And by fundamental limits, it means, for example, what kind of toleration to the network delay, to the network partitioning you can achieve? How many Byzantine nodes can you have in your network such that you can still achieve this abstraction? So you can see that the questions asked are somewhat similar in these two fields, separated by 30 years. But now in the past 40 years, interesting thing I observed is that there is rather limited interaction between these two fields. And in this talk, I want to discuss a problem that we just solved, which leverages of this connection to build insight into the consensus problem. So the focus of this talk is actually on consensus, not on information theory. But at the end, I will wrap back and connect it back to the information theory problem. Okay, all right. Okay, so I need to go through a little bit of history before I can set up the problem that we solved. So let's start with Lamport, 1982 paper. In that paper, they asked this question, which is, okay, in simple setting where the network is synchronous, so there's no network partitioning, how many bad guys can you tolerate? And the answer was simple. It showed that the consensus can be achieved if half the nodes are adversary. And this followed by a paper, very nice paper by Deleuze and Strong, which give a much more efficient communication, efficient protocol to achieve the same performance. Now, just a little bit caveat for the expert in the audience, the result actually showed even a stronger result, which basically says even if 99% of the guys are bad, you can still achieve consensus in the sense of safety and liveness. However, you cannot use that to build an abstraction for which the external observer, who doesn't know who are honest and who are not honest, to be able to figure out what this ledger, what this output log is. So you give a constraint that the external observer has to get this log and knows by taking, for example, majority vote, then 50% is the limit. Okay. All right. So 50% is the fundamental limit of this problem. Now, in 1988, about 6 years later, Dwork, Lynch, and Stockmeyer asked the following question. Well, the synchronous model is okay. However, it is not a very robust model because what happens if suddenly your network partition for a while, then you really cannot assume your delay is bounded by this delta. And so they formulated the problem where you can, in addition to having delay and adversary nodes, also allow the network to partition for a certain period of time and then rejoins again. And this is so-called partial synchronous model. And what they showed is that in this model, consensus can be achieved only if the 33% of the nodes are adversary or less. So this more severe model requires a lower threshold. And the protocol they invented, and many people did a lot of work on this problem with more and more efficient protocol, all have this characteristic, which is shown in this simulation. So I'm putting this plot, this kind of plot will show up again several times in this talk. So let me make sure people understand what this is. So first you have a time in the x-axis. Y-axis, you have the length of the transactions of the ledger, the log. So you can see over time, when you run this protocol, what happens there is that the ledger increases until the network partitions. And when the network partitions, what happens is now the protocol becomes very cautious. And they don't want to confirm any new transactions anymore because they only get very few votes from other nodes. And so during partition, the ledger doesn't grow. And after the partition is over, the protocol grows again. And in fact, there's an interesting threshold, which basically says that if you get more than 67% approval in terms of signatures, then they say, okay, now I can confirm transactions. And people often call this finality. That means at this point, you can confirm a transaction, put it in the log, and it will not be kicked out again. Okay, so this is a very nice paper by Dwork, Lynch, and Stockmeyer with a lot of follow-up work with many protocols. This is 1988. Let's fast forward again for 20 years, and now we've come to the modern era. And something really interesting happened in 2008, okay? So in 2008, a white paper, and a system showed up. And this is the famous system Bitcoin by a personal group, people nicknamed Nakamoto, peer-to-peer electronic cash system. So what is this system? This is a system that nowadays we call a cryptocurrency, which basically tries to enable a currency which is not decentralized. In other words, there is no single centralized authority, like a centralized mint, that mint the currency. So it's maintained across a worldwide scale distributed network, peer-to-peer. So if you think about this kind of system, what do you really need? Okay, to achieve the system, you need a consensus on a common ledger. That is, everyone believes in the past on the state of how many people who owns how many Bitcoin. So therefore, consensus is central to this problem. You have many nodes, and they're all sitting in different parts of the world. So this is a distributed consensus problem. Now, this network has economic value, actually very high economic value, billions and billions of dollars of value nowadays. So therefore, there is very strong incentive for bad actors to try to attack the system and tries to disrupt the ledger formation and make the ledger untrustworthy so that people lose trust in the system. And so therefore, this is a Byzantine distributed consensus problem, very much in the flavor of what Lamport and his colleagues envisioned in 1982. But in fact, it is really the first large-scale such system built since then. Very interestingly, the algorithm, the protocol that achieves consensus, Byzantine distributed consensus, although it is the same general problem, the protocol looks completely different. For example, completely different from the Dwork protocol that we just discussed earlier. So let's say a few words about how this protocol works. And of course, the name of this protocol is actually called blockchain. So that's where blockchains came from. So blockchain is nothing but a Byzantine distributed consensus protocol. Cool. All right. So the good thing about Nakamoto's blockchain is you can describe it in 1 minute. So here's how it works. So these are the nodes in the network. In the blockchain, in Nakamoto's language, they're called miners. So what you do is you have this blockchain and you start with a block, Genesis block. And in each of these blocks, there is a bunch of transactions. These are your sequence of transactions that you try to get agreement on. And the protocol is very simple. Each node tries to solve a very hard hash puzzle. And the first node who succeeds in solving the hash puzzle gets to attach a new block to the current blockchain. And the process goes on and on repeatedly. Different nodes will get blocks, and they will all extend this chain. So you may ask, wait a minute, what is the protocol? Where's the protocol? Well, actually, the protocol is very simple. The protocol simply says that everybody should mine or should try to extend the chain on the tip, on the longest chain. So I'm showing you a picture where there's only one chain, but in reality, there may be forks, there may be other chains, but every node on the protocol should follow the longest chain. And that's it. That's it. That's the protocol. Okay? So it's a very simple, beautifully simple protocol. Now, if you think about what happened in consensus, usually what happens is that people formulate a model, like the Dwork partial synchronous model, and they try to build a protocol to achieve optimality on that model, optimal threshold, or so-called resilience of, say, 1/3. Okay. Now, Nakamoto is different, though. He's a practitioner, so he built the system. So he came up with, or she or they came up with, this protocol. And so now we have to do some reverse engineering, which is, okay, so what consensus problem or what model is this protocol good for, actually? So the reverse engineering is the typical thing that an academic does. And so there's a lot of work done on that in the past 10 years to try to understand what Nakamoto's blockchain is trying to solve. And the final analysis turns out that it's solving a problem which is neither the synchronous nor the partially synchronous model, but yet it's another model. To understand this model, let's understand the setting for which Bitcoin is designed for. Okay, so the setting is that you have many participants. So in Bitcoin, there are about 10,000 miners, 10,000 these nodes sitting around all over the world. And the model, the assumption is that, hey, you really can't count on everyone to be around all the time because, you know, some miners may decide to instead of mining Bitcoin, mine another currency, or decides that energy is too expensive, electricity is too expensive, I'm going to turn off my node for a while and then rejoin later. So this notion of dynamic participation, which is not really in all the earlier models, is actually central to making this protocol work. And so what happens is that as you move over time, you expect that the number of online participants to become smaller. In this case, for example, maybe the electricity became very expensive, there are very few miners, but after a while, it may increase again, etc. So this is the environment that Nakamoto's blockchain is designed for. And the theorem, which is done after Nakamoto, is to show that if you assume that the network is synchronous for the online participants, okay, which actually, then you can prove that consensus can be achieved if 50% of the online nodes are adversary, and assuming the rest is asleep. Okay. So the important thing is 50% not of all nodes, but of the online nodes are adversary. That's the assumption, and that's a beautiful paper by Garay and Al in 2015. Okay, so let's recap a little bit before we try to formulate our problem. So this is exactly the midpoint of the talk. So far we've talked about 3 network models. Okay, synchronous, partially synchronous, and dynamic participation. What you should think of is they are really trust assumptions. They are assumptions you made about the network, which actually may not be verifiable, but you're making them anyway. So this is your trust. And based on this trust, you do certain things in your consensus. So Lamport started with the synchronous model. Dwork and Al extended it to the partially synchronous model. So Dwork and Al says, hey, I don't really trust this synchronous assumption. It's too strong. I want to weaken this assumption to allow for the possibility of the network partitioning. Okay. So what does it mean by network partitioning? It means that, hey, the network, the users may split into two, the nodes may split into 2 groups, and you don't really know what the other group is doing. So you have to be very cautious when you make decisions as an individual node. And so it's a much more severe channel network. On the other hand, Nakamoto took it into a different direction. They said that, well, actually, I'm not going to assume network partition, but I'm going to assume that starting with the synchronous model, I'm going to extend it and allow nodes to actually leave the network and go offline, and then come online again and go offline. And the assumption is that it's just, dynamic. The fact that I don't see some nodes doesn't mean that those guys are doing something bad. And that's the model that Nakamoto assumes. So it turns out that both are in some sense a weakening of the synchronous model, weakening in terms of making the adversary more powerful, I should say. However, the direction is very different. And actually, these 2 class of protocols are also very different. And to see that, let's start with our example. So now we have a dynamic number of nodes, okay? They're going up and down, and 67 turns out to be an important threshold. So we draw a line there at 67. And during this time, the network may partition as well. So let's run the longest chain protocol and see what happens on this network environment. So if I run the longest chain protocol, what you will see is that the ledger, remember, the y-axis is the length of the ledger, how long the ledger is. The ledger just keeps on growing, okay? This is like ever ready. Bunny never stops, keeps on growing, because the longest chain protocol is everybody mines continuously. When there are few miners, you get a block slower, but you still get a block, and you just keep on extending the chain. So it keeps on growing. No matter whether the network partition or the low participation, high participation, it keeps on growing. And we call this property, the community call this property, dynamic availability. That means the protocol is always available. The consensus engine is always available in spite of the dynamism of the nodes. Okay. On the other hand, if you on the same network environment, if you run the partially synchronous protocol, okay, a partially synchronous protocol, doesn't matter which one, actually, there are many of them, then as we mentioned earlier, you will see a very different type of situation whereby during network partition or low participation, the protocol, the ledger, the log will stall because it just stalls, okay? So you can see that is very different. And basically it's based on different trust assumptions, okay? However, because you are very cautious, the blocks that you commit is so-called final, and this is called finality, okay? So whereas in dynamic availability, when the network partition, for example, then the blocks you put in the blockchain could be replaced but another chain grow in a different part of the network. When you rejoin, that chain may become the longer chain, and your blocks may get kicked out of the ledger. And so you don't have this finality. And basically, the left-hand side is like an optimist. Imagine you are a node, you're a miner, you're a node in this network. When you don't hear stuff from offline nodes, you just assume, hey, my peers I don't hear from, I'm just doing nothing, they're just on vacation. On the other hand, for the partial synchronous protocol, it is making a pessimistic assumption. Hey, if the peers I don't hear from, they must be plotting against me. And so if I don't hear from too many people, I should not commit any more transactions. I should just stall the transactions and wait until I get more people voting. Okay, more nodes voting. So that's the situation. Okay, and this is an interesting picture because if you look at all the blockchain protocols now out there, they can basically be divided into two types: the left type, longest chain type, or the partial synchronous type. Okay. All right. So this leads to a very natural question that has received quite a bit of attention in the past few years in the blockchain world, which is, okay, so dynamic availability is a good property because, think about Bitcoin. It just keeps on running. Imagine if Bitcoin decided to stop for a few days. That would be not so good. A lot of people will not be able to do transactions, and they'll be very upset. On the other hand, finality is also a good property because in case, something bad happens, I'm very conservative and therefore my transactions will still not be reversed. So final. So a natural question is, hey, can I build property that can provide both these properties, a protocol that provides both these properties of availability and finality? Okay. And it is pretty clear from our discussion that the answer is actually no. Okay. And this has been proved rigorously in two papers, Pass and Shi, and recently in a paper by Louis Pai and Ralph Garden, which showed that no, it's not possible. Intuitively, it's pretty clear though, because if you run a protocol and you want to achieve finality, then your ledger must grow on like the right-hand side. If you want dynamic availability, it must grow like the left-hand side, always growing. So how can you have one protocol which gives you one ledger that grows in two different ways? That's impossible. So that's why the answer is no. Okay. So that's where we came in. So a few months ago, we started thinking about this problem, and we came up with a way to resolve this dilemma. So we call this the availability-finality dilemma because it seems that you have to decide between either available or final protocol, and that's what the current blockchain world does. We claim that actually you can do better. You can do better than that. And the idea here is to build another abstraction, okay? And the abstraction here is like our state machine replication abstraction in the Byzantine consensus world. Again, the inputs are transactions. You have a protocol pipe. But now, instead of outputting one ledger, we output two ledgers, okay? One ledger we call the finalized ledger, locked in. And the other ledger we call the dynamic available ledger, okay? All right. And the ledger has to have the constraint that locked in is a prefix of locked DA. Okay, so what's going on here? Why two ledger? What's going on? So to do that, let's see a simulation of a protocol like this one. So what should it look like? So the blue ledger looks like an output of a partially synchronous protocol. The red one looks like an output of a dynamic available protocol. But the prefix constraint means that when the network environment is good, such as when you have high participation and no partitioning, then the two ledger will coincide. And so the idea is the following. There may be users who are very optimistic, okay? The optimists will believe in the dynamic available ledger. So they will keep on committing transactions. They want to keep on going. They don't want to stop. So there are other pessimists who are more conservative, and they only believe in the finalized ledger. Okay. However, they can still talk to each other because when the network has no partition or high participation, because of the prefix constraint, they all agree among each other what the ledger is, and so they can all transact together. However, during partition, the finalized ledger may get held back. The finalized ledger may get held back because they are not, they're conservative. The dynamic ledger keeps on growing, okay? So at this point, the finalized ledger will not confirm as many transactions as the dynamic available ledger, okay? However, everyone, because of the prefix relationship, everyone can believe in the finalized ledger. But the more optimist users will also believe in dynamic available ledger. Okay. So a very natural question is, well, okay, this is a desired property. Okay. The question is, does a protocol with this ebb and flow property actually exist? So we call this property ebb and flow because the two ledgers they sometimes catch up, and sometimes the finalized ledger is behind the dynamic ledger, sometimes it catches up with the dynamic ledger. So it's like the moon attracting the ocean, the waves ebb and flow. Okay. So before I answer this question, let me make one remark though, is that we are definitely not the first one who came up with this idea of generating multiple ledger. And in fact, an early work last year, very nice piece of work by Marky, Nayak, and Ran, also generated these two ledgers. They call it flexible BFP. But the setting is completely different. They're not interested in this availability-finality problem. Also, the constraint relating to two ledgers are also not the same as the prefix constraint here. So it's a rather different problem. And so instead of me spending time talking about that here, you can certainly take a look at our paper where we give a very careful comparison. Okay, so that's a side path. So let me now use my remaining 10 minutes here to answer this question, which is, does a protocol with this ebb and flow property exist? So we, like what Madhu said, I really like what he said at the end when he answered the question. He said, you know, sometimes the problem is as important as the solution. And so at this point, our contribution, I think, is to formulate clearly what the problem is. That is, I want to build a pi protocol which generates these two ledgers with this prefix constraint property and with this ebb and flow property. But we still need to figure out what exists. Okay. Well, the first observation is that you do not have a prefix constraint between these two ledgers. The problem is triggered. Okay. And here's why. Because you give me the transactions, I will run two protocols in parallel. Okay, one is partially synchronous and one is dynamic available, like the longest chain protocol. So that's why I give you two output, no problem. However, there's no agreement, no consistency between these two. And so the people who believe in blue and the people who believe in red can't talk to each other. Okay, and we see how bad this kind of situation is when the blue people can't talk to the red people. Okay, so what we want is the prefix constraint, which allows these two groups of people to talk to each other, to communicate, to achieve consensus. And here's our solution. Okay, and we call this a snap and chat construction. Okay, all right. So let me explain a little bit more about this construction. Okay, all right. So we take an input transactions. Our goal is to output these two ledger, log fin and log DA. Okay. So the first step we do is we take the transactions and pump it into a dynamic available protocol, like the longest chain, like Nakamoto's longest chain. You can take that example. There are other actually dynamic available protocol which is developed after Nakamoto, but just, you know, be concrete, take longest chain. Now at the output, what you see is an ever-growing ledger. Okay. And what this protocol does is it will take snapshots at different times of this ledger ever growing. And it fits these snapshots, treating them as like meta transactions into a partially synchronous protocol. Doesn't matter which one, a partially synchronous protocol. And the output of the partially synchronous protocol are the finalized snapshots. Okay, these are like finalized the transactions that Pi partially synchronous deems it finalizable, and that goes into log_fin. Now, what goes into log_da? It turns out what goes in log_da is a little bit more complicated. It is not simply taking the output of Pi da, because if you do, then you may not have this prefix relationship. And so what we do is we explicitly concatenate log_fin to the snapshot together to form the dynamic available ledger by forcing this prefix property. Okay, so that's our construction. And our construction is really a black box construction. It's not a particular protocol. It's actually a whole family of protocol, because what we showed is that effectively what you can do is you can take any dynamic available ledger protocol Pi da, you can take any partial synchronous protocol P_sync, and then you can concatenate them together this way, and you get a protocol which is what we call snap and chat. So snapshot, and then the Pi P_sync chat about the snapshots. Okay. All right, the theorem. Okay, so basically what we showed is that this protocol that we constructed, or this construction, achieves the app and flow property. Okay, what does that mean? So first of all, we know that by construction, log_fin is a prefix of log_da, so that's good, right? So they can talk to each other. Now, if you look at log_fin, okay, and we show that consensus achieved on log_fin under partial synchrony. So if the log_fin, the blue users, blue clients, assumes the partial synchronous, that is, assumes network partition, it can still be guaranteed that consensus is achieved, if as long as less than 33% of the nodes are adversarial. For the red users, the red clients, we can show that if they assume that less than 50% of the online nodes are adversarial, okay, then consensus is achieved on log_da. Okay, so therefore each individual output has a guarantee on when they can achieve consensus. And that's what we mean by security theorem. Okay, that means no matter what the adversary does, we can still achieve consensus on these two separate ledgers. But at the same time, they have this prefix property that we actually impose in this protocol. Okay. So I don't have time to talk about the proof of this result, but I just want to point out a few subtleties here, which is, notice that the security or the consensus on each of the ledger is only under their respective assumption. Okay, which means that, for example, you could have a situation where you have partial synchrony, and therefore the longest chain protocol is no longer secure because it's too aggressive. But yet we can show that even though this one is not secure, the log_fin, the output, is still secure. Consensus is still achieved. Conversely, we can also show that even if Pi P_sync is not secure, but if Pi da is secure, then log_da is also secure. Okay, so it's a little bit subtle. The details you can find on the paper. But turns out we can claim actually that not only this protocol has this app and flow property, that is, it can have safe security or consensus on each of the ledger, it is actually also optimal in some sense. So what does it mean? So here I'm plotting now no longer a single threshold. So before, when we say protocol is optimal, it means that it can tolerate a maximum number of bad users. Here we have two ledgers, and so there are two axes. One is dynamic participation, one is partial synchrony. And what we know from early result, Nakamoto's protocol, for example, is that you can't do better than 50% in terms of dynamic participation. Okay. Block And Al also showed that you cannot achieve better than 33% under partial synchrony. Okay. What we showed is that the snap and check protocol can actually achieve both 33% and 50% on the two ledger, and thereby optimal individually, but at the same time imposes prefix constraint so that everybody, blue and red, can always talk to each other through the finalized ledger. And when the finalized ledger becomes live, that is under good conditions, then everybody can talk to each other over all the transactions. Okay, that's the result. So I'll use my remaining few minutes here to connect it back to information theory. So in the beginning, we talked about the point-to-point problem, and it turns out that this problem we formulated is very connected to a problem in information theory. So let me spend 2 minutes talking about that. So point-to-point was the beginning, but actually information theory went a long way. And in particular, they talk about, instead of saying point-to-point, maybe talk about one point to multiple points. And this is a problem formed by Cover, typo here, 1972, not 1948, 1972, where he considered the problem of sending information simultaneously to two receivers, two decoders, broadcast information. Okay. And in a few years later, people asked a particular question within this broadcast channel, which is, okay, suppose I want to send bits, and some of these bits will be received by decoder 1, and all of them will be received by decoder 2. Okay, so why would one want to do that? Imagine one decoder may only want a low resolution of the video that you're watching. The other decoder maybe has a strong, bigger, better device. It wants to decode the whole thing. So this is a problem with degraded message set formulated by Turner and Maton. And really, the problem is to build an abstraction of sending these bits 1011, 101001, such that one guy gets the prefix 1011, the other guy gets all the bits 1011, 101001. So I think there's a pretty nice analogy between this degraded message set problem and the ebb and flow property that we found. Okay, so I'm done. If you want to look at more details, you can find this paper on arXiv. We just put that up a few weeks ago. And I'm happy to also answer any questions, maybe later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. Let's applaud if we can, in a way.